In the summer of 1993, a reporter for the Charleston Gazette named Thomas Whitley drove into the Appalachian Mountains with a tape recorder, a notebook, and a simple assignment. He was documenting the last generation of coal miners for a human interest series. 32 days later, his editor received a package in the mail. Inside was Whitley's press badge, his wedding ring, and a single cassette tape with 4 words written on the label in his handwriting: "Don't look for me." Thomas Whitley never returned to Charleston. His wife filed a missing persons report. The police searched the hollers where he'd been working. They found his rental car abandoned on a logging road near a town that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. The doors were unlocked. His luggage was still in the trunk, but Thomas Whitley was gone. And 20 years later, when a graduate student doing research on Appalachian oral histories found his interview tapes in a university archive, she listened to them once, then locked them away and changed her thesis topic entirely. She never explained why. What Thomas Whitley found in those mountains wasn't just a story. It was a wound in the fabric of a community, something that had been bleeding quietly for generations, hidden beneath the folklore and the poverty and the pride. And once he understood what he was looking at, he couldn't unknow it. Neither can you. Not after this. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story begins not in 1993, but in 1947, in a hollow so deep the sun only touched the valley floor for 3 hours a day in winter. The people who lived there had names that went back to the earliest settlement days. The Prestons, the Carvers, the Ludlows, the Shaws. They worked the mines, buried their dead in the same cemetery their great-grandfathers had cleared, and kept their business to themselves. But that year, something changed. The children started disappearing. Not all at once. Not in a way that made headlines. Just one here, one there, over the course of 18 months. 7 children in total. And when the state police finally came to investigate, the families told them the same thing, in the same flat voices. The mountain took them. Thomas Whitley arrived in McDowell County, with no knowledge of what had happened 46 years earlier. He was there for the living, not the dead. His editor wanted profiles of men whose fathers and grandfathers had given their lungs to the coal companies, men who could speak to the dignity of hard labor and the death of an American industry. Simple stories, human stories, the kind that won awards and made readers feel something safe and distant over their morning coffee. The first 3 interviews went exactly as planned. Retired miners in their 70s and 80s, sitting on porches that sagged under the weight of decades, talking about shift work and union fights and the particular silence of being 2 miles underground. Whitley recorded everything. He was good at his job. He knew how to make people comfortable, how to ask questions that opened doors instead of closing them. And then he met Virgil Shaw. Virgil was 81 years old when Whitley sat down with him in the front room of a house that still had wallpaper from the Eisenhower administration. Virgil had worked in the mines for 43 years. His father had died in a collapse in 1932. His son had left for Ohio in 1970 and never came back. Virgil was alone now, and he talked for nearly 2 hours about the weight of coal dust in your clothes, the taste of iron in the water, the way a mountain changes shape over decades of extraction. And then, as Whitley was packing up his equipment, Virgil said something that stopped him cold. "You know why there's no children here anymore, don't you?" Whitley didn't know what he meant. The young people had left for jobs, for cities, for lives that didn't end in black lung and poverty. That was the story everywhere in Appalachia. But Virgil shook his head slowly, the way you do when you're correcting someone who doesn't understand the truth of something. "Not just now," Virgil said. "I mean back then, 1947. We gave them to the mountain, and the mountain hasn't forgotten." Whitley asked what he meant. Virgil stared at him for a long time, and then he said, "You sure you want to know? Because once I tell you, you can't unhear it. It'll sit in your chest like black lung, and it won't ever leave." Thomas Whitley said yes. He wanted to know. He was a reporter. That's what reporters did. They asked questions. They found the truth. They told stories that needed telling. So Virgil Shaw told him. And on the tape, you can hear the exact moment Thomas Whitley realized he'd made a mistake. There's a long pause, then a sound like someone trying to steady their breathing, and then Virgil's voice, low and deliberate, saying, "The first one they took was Eleanor Preston. She was 6 years old. Eleanor Preston disappeared on a Tuesday morning in March of 1947. She'd been playing near the creek that ran behind her family's house, and when her mother called her in for lunch, there was no answer. They found her doll floating in the water, tangled in tree roots, but Eleanor was gone. The sheriff organized a search. 50 men combed the woods for 3 days. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if she'd simply dissolved into the air. The Prestons were devastated, but they were also practical people, the kind who understood that the world was cruel and that mountains held dangers. They held a funeral with an empty casket. They tried to move forward. And then, 6 weeks later, it happened again. Michael Carver, age 7, vanished while walking home from school. Then Sarah Ludlow, age 5, gone from her own backyard while her father chopped wood 30 feet away. He turned around to stack the logs, and when he looked back, she was gone. By the time the 4th child disappeared, the community was fracturing. Accusations flew. Neighbors who'd known each other for generations stopped speaking. Some families packed up and left in the night, heading for Kentucky or West Virginia's eastern panhandle, anywhere but that hollow. But most stayed. They had nowhere else to go. The mine was their life. The land was their history. And something in them couldn't accept that they were being hunted. The state police came in June of 1947, after the 5th disappearance. They interviewed everyone. They brought dogs. They searched abandoned mine shafts and root cellars and every conceivable hiding place, and they found nothing. But what they did notice was the way people talked. The families of the missing children were grief-stricken, yes, but there was something else beneath it. Something that looked almost like resignation. Like they'd known this was coming. Like they'd been waiting for it. One of the state investigators, a man named Dutch Holloway, wrote in his report that the community seemed to be protecting something, not someone, something. He noted that when he asked direct questions about enemies or suspicious outsiders, people answered readily enough. But when he asked about the land itself, about the mountain, about the old stories, they went quiet. Their faces closed, and more than once, he heard the same phrase repeated. The mountain takes what it's owed. Holloway didn't know what that meant. He was a city man, raised in Wheeling, educated in a world of evidence and procedure. But he felt it. He wrote that the hollow had a weight to it, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, like being underground even when you were standing in sunlight. He recommended the case remain open, but he also recommended that no one station officers there permanently. His report ended with a single sentence that was later redacted from the public file. There is something wrong with that place, and I do not believe it can be fixed by law. The 6th and 7th children disappeared in September of 1947. After that, it stopped. No more vanishings. No bodies were ever found. And the families who remained made a silent agreement never to speak of it outside the hollow. They buried the memory the way they buried their dead, deep and unmarked. Thomas Whitley asked Virgil Shaw the question any rational person would ask. Who took them? Was it a drifter? A predator? Someone the community was protecting out of misplaced loyalty or fear? Virgil looked at him like he'd asked why the sky was blue. Nobody took them, he said. We gave them. On the tape, you can hear Whitley's confusion. He asks Virgil to clarify. Virgil lights a cigarette, and there's the sound of the match striking, the long exhale of smoke, and then he begins to talk about the mine. The Shaw family had been mining coal in that hollow since 1873. Virgil's great-grandfather had opened the first drift mine, just a horizontal tunnel cut into the mountainside, following a seam that seemed to go on forever. The coal was good, dense, and clean burning. It made the Shaws a modest living, and eventually other families joined them. By 1900, there were 4 families working the mountain together. The Prestons, the Carvers, the Ludlows, the Shaws. They built their homes, they raised their children, they went to church on Sundays, and the mine gave them everything they needed. But in 1946, something changed. The seam they'd been working for decades ran dry, not slowly, the way coal deposits usually peter out. It happened almost overnight. They were pulling full carts one week, and the next week, They were hitting empty rock. The families panicked. Without the mine, they had nothing. No income, no future. The company stores wouldn't extend credit. The children were hungry. Winter was coming. Virgil's father and the other men went deeper. They opened new tunnels, followed fractures in the rock, searching desperately for another seam, and they found something. Not coal, a chamber. Virgil described it as a natural cathedral, a hollow space inside the mountain that shouldn't have existed according to any geology they understood. The walls were smooth, almost polished. The air was warmer than it should have been. And in the center of the chamber was a shaft that dropped straight down into darkness so complete their lanterns couldn't touch the bottom. The men stood at the edge of that shaft, and they felt something. Virgil said his father described it as a pull, like gravity but wrong, like the darkness below was breathing and wanted them to come closer. They left quickly. They sealed the tunnel behind them, and they agreed never to speak of it. But that night, Virgil's father had a dream. In the dream, a voice that wasn't quite a voice told him that the mountain would provide again. All it asked was a small sacrifice, something precious, something that would hurt to give. When Virgil's father woke up, he found that every other man who'd been in that chamber had dreamed the same thing. They met in secret. They argued. Some wanted to leave, to abandon everything and start over somewhere else. But others said they couldn't. Where would they go? How would they survive? And the voice in the dream had promised the mountain would provide. They made the decision on a February night in 1947 in the back room of the company store after it had closed. 4 men. Virgil's father, Edmund Shaw, Eleanor Preston's grandfather, Caleb Preston, Michael Carver's father, Joseph Carver, and Sarah Ludlow's uncle, Thomas Ludlow. They were the heads of the families, the ones who carried the weight of survival on their shoulders. And they decided that 7 children, spread out over time so it wouldn't be obvious, was a price they could bear if it meant the rest would live. Virgil's voice on the tape is steady when he describes this. There's no emotion in it, no judgment. He's simply stating what happened, the way you'd describe the steps of a recipe or the mechanics of a machine. He says they drew lots to determine which families would give up a child and in what order. They agreed that it had to be done in a way that looked natural, like disappearances, so that no one outside the hollow would dig too deep. And they agreed that the children would be told they were going on a special trip, that they'd walk into the chamber willingly, so there wouldn't be screaming or struggle. It had to be peaceful. That was important to them. They wanted to believe they were being merciful. Thomas Whitley asks, on the tape, how they could do it. How could fathers and grandfathers and uncles lead children into the dark and leave them there? And Virgil says something that's worse than any answer Whitley expected. He says, because the mountain kept its promise. After Eleanor Preston was taken into the chamber, after her family walked her to the edge of that shaft and told her to climb down the rope ladder they'd hung into the darkness, after they heard her small voice calling up, asking when they'd come get her, and after they pulled the ladder up and sealed the tunnel behind them, the mine opened up again. The next morning, the men went to work and found a new seam, thick, rich, enough coal to sustain the families for decades. It was exactly where the dream had told them it would be. The same thing happened after each child. A new vein would appear, the mine would provide, and the families would prosper just enough to survive another season, another year. By the time the 7th child was taken, it was routine. Horrific routine, but routine nonetheless. The children were told they were going to see something magical. They were walked into the mountain, and they never came back. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. Virgil told Thomas Whitley that his father never recovered from what they'd done. He drank himself to death by 1953. Most of the other men involved died young too, from accidents or heart attacks or suicide that was never called suicide. The families who stayed in the hollow carried the secret like a hereditary disease, passed down in whispers and warning looks. Don't go near the old tunnels. Don't ask about the children who disappeared. Don't ever, ever speak of what the mountain was given. And then Virgil said the thing that made Thomas Whitley's hands shake so badly he nearly dropped the tape recorder. He said, the mine's been closed since 1981, played out again, and I've been having the dreams again. Same voice, same promise, the mountain's waiting. Thomas Whitley didn't leave after that interview. He should have. Any reasonable person would have thanked Virgil Shaw for his time, packed up his equipment, driven back to Charleston, and filed the story away as the ramblings of an old man whose mind had been poisoned by guilt and isolation. But Whitley wasn't ready to leave, because something Virgil said had hooked into him. The mine had closed in 1981, and the hollow had been dying ever since. The young people left, the old people stayed. And now, in 1993, there were almost no children left in that entire valley. Not because they'd disappeared, because no one was having them anymore. The families had stopped reproducing, as if some unconscious part of them knew that bringing children into that place was dangerous. Whitley spent the next 3 weeks tracking down everyone he could find who had lived in the hollow during 1947. Most were dead. Some had moved away and refused to talk to him. But a few, the very old and the very tired, agreed to speak, and they all told versions of the same story: the chamber, the shaft, the dreams, the children. One woman, Margaret Carver, who was 90 years old and dying of emphysema, told Whitley that she'd been 12 when her younger brother Michael was taken. She remembered the morning her father came home from the secret meeting. She remembered how he couldn't look at Michael anymore, how he'd started drinking even though he'd been a church deacon. And she remembered the day Michael left. Her father told him they were going to see something special deep in the mine, something magical that only brave boys got to see. Michael had been excited. He'd held his father's hand. And when her father came back alone 3 hours later, his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't hold a coffee cup. Margaret told Whitley that her father confessed to her on his deathbed in 1968. He'd been dying of black lung, drowning slowly in his own fluids, and he'd grabbed her hand and told her everything. He said that when they'd lowered Michael into the shaft, the boy had climbed down willingly, thinking it was an adventure. And then, when they pulled up the ladder, Michael had called up from the darkness, asking when they were coming to get him. Her father said they waited at the top of the shaft for 10 minutes, listening. Michael called out 5 times. His voice got quieter each time, farther away, as if he was moving deeper into something that shouldn't have existed. And then there was silence. Not the silence of a child who'd stopped talking. The silence of a space where sound couldn't exist anymore. Whitley asked Margaret if she believed her father's story. She looked at him with eyes that had seen most of a century and said, "I know my brother didn't run away. I know he didn't drown in the creek. And I know that mine gave us 20 more years of coal after he disappeared. So yes, I believe him." By the 4th week, Thomas Whitley had interviewed 9 people. Every single one of them confirmed the story in one way or another. Some had been children at the time. Some had been young adults who'd suspected but not known. And one man, Robert Ludlow, had been part of it. He was 73 years old, and he'd helped take his niece Sarah into the mountain when he was 27. He told Whitley that he still heard her voice sometimes, calling from inside the walls of his house. He said the mountain never lets you forget what you owe it. And then Robert Ludlow told Whitley something that wasn't on any of the other tapes. He said that in 1992, the year before Whitley arrived, 3 families had moved back to the hollow. Young families. People who'd left years ago and had come back because the cost of living was low and they were desperate. They had children, 5 children total, ranging in age from 4 to 9 years old. And Robert said he'd been having the dreams again. So had the other old men who were still alive. The mountain was waiting. It had been patient for 46 years, but it was hungry again. And it knew there were children in the hollow. Thomas Whitley left the hollow on the 31st day. He packed his rental car in the early morning, while the mist was still thick in the valley. He'd filled 14 cassette tapes with interviews. He'd taken photographs of the sealed mine entrance, the cemetery where 7 empty graves sat in a row with dates from 1947, and the houses where families still lived who carried the weight of what had been done. He had a story, the kind of story that would change his career, maybe even change history. Expose a dark American secret that had been buried for nearly half a century. But somewhere on the drive back to Charleston, Thomas Whitley pulled over on that logging road, and he sat in his car for a long time, thinking about what Robert Ludlow had told him. The dreams had started again. The old men were having them, and there were 5 children in the hollow now, children whose parents had no idea what they'd moved into. No idea that their neighbors were descendants of people who'd made an agreement with something that lived inside the mountain, something that was patient, something that remembered debts. If Thomas Whitley published his story, what would happen? Would the authorities come? Would they dig into the mountain and find the chamber, find the shaft, find whatever was at the bottom? Would they find the remains of 7 children? Or would they find nothing at all because those children had gone somewhere that evidence couldn't follow? And if he published the story, would it stop what was coming? Or would it just spread the knowledge of how to make the mountain provide, like instructions for a ritual that other desperate places might try? On one of the final tapes, there's a recording that wasn't an interview. It's just Whitley talking to himself, processing what he'd learned. His voice is different, strained. He says, "I don't know if I believe in evil. I've seen terrible things in my career. Human cruelty, neglect, poverty that grinds people down to nothing. But this is different. This isn't just what people did. This is what people did because something else asked them to. And that something is still there, still waiting, still hungry." He talks for 17 minutes on that tape. He works through the logic. If he exposes the story, the families who live there now will be destroyed. The old men who confess to him will die in prison. The hollow will become a spectacle, a horror tourist destination. And the 5 children who live there now will grow up knowing that their neighbors once sacrificed children to keep a mine running. But if he doesn't publish the story, if he walks away, then he's complicit. He's protecting the secret. And if the dreams are real, if the old men are right, then 5 more children might disappear, and their blood will be on his hands too. At the end of the tape, Thomas Whitley makes his decision. He says, "I can't publish this. I can't carry this story into the world, but I can't do nothing either." And then the recording cuts off. The package his editor received contained his press badge, his wedding ring, and 1 tape. Not the interviews. Just a single tape with Virgil Shaw's voice describing what had happened in 1947. No context, no other names, no explanation of what Thomas Whitley had decided to do. His wife told police that in the weeks before he disappeared, Thomas had become withdrawn. He'd stopped sleeping. He'd started talking about moral debts and prices that had to be paid. She thought he was having a breakdown. The graduate student who found the tapes in 2013 never explained what she heard that made her change her entire thesis, but she did make 1 phone call before she locked them away. She called the county clerk's office in McDowell County and asked about birth and death records for a specific hollow, and what she found was that between April of 1993 and January of 1994, 5 children had died, all listed as accidents: 1 drowning, 2 falls, 1 carbon monoxide poisoning. 1 disappeared and was presumed dead. The families moved away within months. The hollow is empty now, completely abandoned. The mine entrance was sealed with concrete in 1995 by order of the state. No explanation was ever given for why. Thomas Whitley's body was never found. His rental car was discovered on that logging road, unlocked, with his luggage still inside. But there was one detail the police report mentioned that was never followed up on: mud on the driver's side floorboard, the kind of mud that comes from deep underground. And on the passenger seat, they found a coil of rope, new and unused, with one end tied into a loop, the kind of loop you'd use to lower something, or someone, into a dark place. No one knows what Thomas Whitley did in those missing hours between leaving the hollow and abandoning his car. But the mine entrance logs, the ones kept by the State Environmental Agency, show that the concrete seal was intact when they inspected it in 1995. Whatever happened, happened before they sealed it forever. And if Thomas Whitley walked into that mountain, if he found the chamber and the shaft, and decided that the only way to stop what was coming was to give the mountain what it wanted, to offer himself so that 5 children could live, then he made a choice that the 4 men in 1947 couldn't make. He paid the debt with his own life instead of someone else's. Or maybe he just couldn't live with what he knew. Maybe the weight of that knowledge crushed him the same way the mountain had crushed generations of miners. Maybe he drove to that logging road and walked into the woods and ended his life in a way that his body would never be found, so his wife could hold on to hope instead of certainty. We'll never know. What we do know is that the story stayed buried. The 5 children lived, and somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, in a hollow that no longer appears on maps, There's a sealed mine entrance with concrete that's already starting to crack from age and weather. And behind that seal, deep in the mountain, there's a chamber. And in that chamber, there's a shaft. And at the bottom of that shaft, there's something that's patient. Something that remembers. Something that will wait as long as it takes for desperate people to come asking for help. Because the mountain always provides. It just needs to be fed first.